Good evening, everybody. First, I would like to thank King Brian Connor for his help in making this video. Though it did cost me some of my finest homemade mead, it was worth it to spend some time with the great king of the leprechauns. Walt Disney himself even thanked King Brian for his help in making this film. Brian would like me to share with you that he did bless Walt, for he was a good friend to the leprechauns. In Walt's studios and parks, they shined for many years. So I'd like to welcome you all to A Bard's Stories. Tonight's story is brought to us by King Brian through the hard work of Walt Disney. Tonight, Darby O'Gill and the Little People. Where to start? What's that, Your Majesty? Yes, the setting. The story is set in a small town of Rathcullen in County Kerry, Ireland. It is a beautiful area, rolling farmlands, manors, quaint little towns. And this, at the Lord Fitzpatrick's manor, is where we meet the lovely Irish lass, Katie O'Gill, played by Jeanette Monroe. Her and her father are caretakers for the Lord, whom has just arrived with a young man, Michael McBride, played by the legendary great actor Sean Connery. Her father was not home. As the Lord asked about his whereabouts, Katie says he is probably out tending the fields, and she will go fetch him right away. The kindly Lord knew he was most likely at the local town pub telling stories, as he explains that to Michael. What's that, Your Majesty? King Brian would like me to add he and Sean were great friends and had many a pint together and had seen all of his movies. Back to the story, if you will. It is now that we meet Darby O'Gill, and he is portrayed by Albert Sharp. And yes, he was indeed at the pub having a drink and telling a story of when he trapped King Brian and how he made his 3 wishes. Of course, all of you can guess one of those was for that pot of gold. And King Brian informs me he allowed Walt to use his very own pot of gold for the making of this movie. When asked if I may see it, King Brian allowed me to see his pot of gold, and it is a large pot. And though many do never see it, I did not trap King Brian, so it is still his. For you see, King Brian is over 5,000 years old, and he does enjoy a good story, a good drink, and a great song. Yes, Your Majesty, Darby made a 4th wish, but if I tell him how you tricked him to making that, it'll take the fun out of it. So we'll let the audience go see this show and see how you did that. Well, Katie did find him there, and he was telling his stories, and she quickly brought him home. He grabbed a sigh, and he ran out, and he found the Lord Fitzpatrick and Michael near the guest manor. Or guest house. Never really were sure what that was, but it was by a beautiful pond. The Lord Fitzpatrick informed Darby he was going to retire him, and Michael would be taking over. Darby took it well, though you could tell it hurt him, and he asked if he could tell Katie himself, for that was where she was born and raised. And the Lord, being kindly, did give him 2 weeks to do so, and to move to a smaller house, rent-free, on half salary for the rest of his days. Darby took Michael back, and he formally introduced him to Katie. And you can tell at first glance there were sparks between them. Later that night, Darby had to go fetch a horse so that he can go get a bell for the church, as he had promised the pastor of the parish. That horse bolted away from him and started running up a hill towards some old ruins. Yes, Your Majesty, I will tell them. Well, if I do, it'll take the surprise away. All right, I should. King Brian put the come hither on Darby, and the horse was part of the way to get him there. Now then, may I continue, your lord? Thank you. It is now we get to meet Your Majesty, King Brian, portrayed by Jimmy O'Day. Brian is playing the pipes, and might I add very well, his people dancing around to the joyful music. When Darby confronts him about why he has put the come hither on him, King Brian tells him that one of his men had been outside and overheard the Lord telling Darby, and that he had brought Darby there to live out the remainder of his life, in days to come, in happiness. Darby was not liking that, as he wanted to be with his Katie, but the come hither was on him. But Darby, being a thinking man, was able to find a way to trick King Brian and the little people and get an escape out of it. Well, he did. You admitted he escaped, and you admitted he tricked you. And no, I'm not telling the people how. They need to watch the show. King Brian was very upset and went to confront Darby when he discovered he had escaped. But Darby, being a thinking man, and a Scot at that, had laid a trap for King Brian. He knew that a leprechaun lost most of his powers at the dawn, but he also knew they liked to drink. So Darby brought out some fine drink and got King Brian drunk enough to forget time. And that morning Darby did indeed capture him. And being that smart thinking man, he made his first wish. A wish to protect the others, that King Brian would stay with him until he had made the other two wishes. That morning, also, we get to hear Michael, singing. I cannot help coming away from the story for a minute, but to think to myself, I wish Sean Connery would have sung more. He had a very deep, beautiful voice, as you will find out when you watch the song. They are having breakfast, and Darby went to fetch the bell. It had to be the next day, because he had brought the bell back, that he'd gone to the pub, and with him a game bag, and in that game bag King Brian. He took him in there so that all could see that his stories of catching the king were true. He had them pour some of their finest, and he put it in the bag, to which King Brian quickly emptied and tossed it out. And sitting here watching King Brian drink some of my meat, I can tell you, he can drink it and put it away quickly. Later that night on his way home, Darby is tackled by Michael, mistaking him for a poacher. And Brian, being the sneaky Brian, every time Michael looked in the bag, he turned himself into a hare, which frustrated Darby and tricked him into making his second wish, that Michael can see King Brian. And King Brian granted it, that he would appear to Michael in his dreams. But before bed, we see King Brian and a very troubled Darby talking. Darby will not make his third wish until he knows what Katie wants and what would make her happy, but he doesn't know. Brian, wanting to be free, but also concerned for his friend, tells Darby to leave it to him. And that night, while Michael and Katie are sleeping, Brian visits them in their dreams, keeping his promise to Darby. He knew there was already a spark, and he helped flame it. And it was that very next day that Michael did kiss Katie. Oh, that is all I can say. King Brian informs me you need to watch to see how that happens and what transpires. Later in the story, a letter arrives from Lord Fitzpatrick, and Katie reads it. It is clear what is in it, and she is packing to move when Michael shows up. She confronts him with it. and he tells her he had promised her father not to tell her. It is then that he tells her he loves her and wants her to be his wife. Oh, he made that fatal mistake of angering an Irish lass, and her temper was hot. Katie runs off in an anger to tell her father of what has happened. Brian, being there at the pub in the bag, Katie knocking it over, escapes by turning himself into a rabbit. Leaving, she is in a rage, but runs off to find their horse, who is leading her up to those same ruins, where she is injured mortally. Darby, running back to find Katie, finds she is not at the manor, but he does find Michael, who had been knocked out by the town bully. Yes, my friends, there is a lot more to this story, but you will need to watch the movie to find out. Darby hears a banshee, and he fears for Katie, and he starts running up towards those ruins. As he does, the banshee appears, and they fight. Darby manages to scare it away, run it off, but he manages to fight it off one way or the other. Michael shows up, and they take Katie home. She really has been mortally wounded. And Darby hears the banshee outside and goes to fight it. And during the fight, the banshee points out to the Mr.Balrog, the death coach. Many of you in the West will know it as the Grim Reaper. He's also known as Headless Horseman, Gankisian in the Irish. And it can never return empty. And this is where Darby makes his third and final wish, that he is taken in the Mr.Balrog instead of Katie. In the coach we see Darby and King Brian riding the last ride together. At least as far as Brian can go. There are limitations. Along the way they are talking, and Brian tricks Darby into making a fourth wish, which immediately voids his others and ejects him from the coach. Later we find Darby telling his story of how he tricked death at the local pub when Michael shows up. And that bully who had been teasing Darby and had knocked him out gets his comeuppings. Ah, the great Sean Connery in fisticuffs. The final scene, we see them riding away in Darby's cart, if you will. Michael and Katie, laughing happily. I would like to again thank King Brian for both his part in the movie and for being here with me to bring this story back to life and to share it with you. If you are truly looking for a fun and enjoyable night with the family, this is one of those movies for certain. My score puts us at a solid 90, based as always on the time period it was made. However, this never ceases to make me smile. It puts me in a better mood. Even making this review, I am smiling and happy. It is one of those movies that when I am done, I really am. I am happy. And for that reason, the feel-good effect. And while it does have Sean Connery, which gives it the bacon effect even, it's a true 10 out of 10 for me. So, a good night from myself and King Brian. And well, a reminder, if you're out and about and you see a swirl of dust, tip your hat out of respect to the little folk. Good night, all.